Jeff, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure, Tom. Well, thanks for the invitation. So my name is Jeff Deuble. I live in Sydney, Australia, and I've been a Christian. I was brought up in a Christian home, and that's been my faith heritage. And there's a journey that's been a part of that. And more recently, I guess, part of that journey's included me having a non-Trinitarian understanding of the Christian faith. But yeah, no, look, it's been a journey that's continued on and taken a few twists and turns in the whole period. I'm married and I've got 3 boys and 6 grandkids.
Cool. So the topic today was reasons to believe in Unitarianism or Christianity or any of those topics. So could you tell me what your position is on Unitarianism? Why do you believe that is true as opposed to Trinitarianism?
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a much more recent part of the journey. And I think most Christians that grow up in, the church basically just fed the orthodox understanding of Jesus, that he is a third person, or he's the second person in the Trinity, that he is co-equal, co-essential and co-eternal with God and is himself fully God, and that as a man on earth, he was both 100% human and 100% divine. So that was the orthodox view that I was taught and that I believed until fairly recently, when my brother actually came to me one day and challenged that view. And that got me rethinking, and that got me on a journey of, just rethinking what I was taught and evaluating it according to what the Bible actually says and doesn't say. And then as a result of that research, I came to believe that Jesus doesn't actually conform to the orthodox or traditional view of the Trinity, that he is actually a very special man who was fully anointed and authorized by God to fulfill a mission in the world, that he has been subsequently glorified and is now at God's right hand, that he is coming again in that glorified position. Does that make sense, Tom?
I believe that does make sense, but the question would be, why specifically do you believe that God or Jesus is not God and vice versa? What reasons do you believe there are for Trinitarians to hold that position, and what reasons do you have to reject that position?
Yeah, okay. Good question. I guess the simple answer is that I don't believe that position, that orthodox position, is what the Bible teaches. I don't believe Jesus ever claimed he was God. There are a couple of statements that he makes that have been, I guess, interpreted by Trinitarians to claim that he said he was God, but I don't believe he ever clearly claimed that of himself. In fact, he very clearly claimed that God was, his God, the Father was his God, and that he was subservient to God, and that all of his capacity was provided by God. So I don't believe Jesus ever claimed to be God. And I don't believe actually the New Testament ever clearly claims that of him either, that the New Testament writers actually believe that. Now, in the New Testament, over 1,300 times, God is referred to and identified as the Father. And Jesus is only possibly identified, it's contentious, maybe between 0 and 12 times. When I say between those numbers, because those who are very skeptical say he's never called God. Those who are much more optimistic about those references claim much more. But there's only actually several that could be, I guess, interpreted as claiming that Jesus was God. And those are very problematic. They're problematic either textually, or they're problematic in terms of the translation bias, or they're problematic in terms of the interpretation. So, really it's a very thin basis for understanding Jesus to be God. And of course, the first century Jews who wrote the New Testament had an Old Testament understanding of who God was. They were fully, completely monotheistic, and there is no indication in the earliest history of the church that they taught anything other than that. In fact, if they would have come up with a Trinitarian understanding of Jesus, that he was fully God, you would expect that that would have caused all sort of ruptions and quarrels and issues within the early church that was mainly Jewish. And even though in the New Testament we read of many controversies, about meat sacrificed to idols, about what day to worship God, about, all sorts of things, circumcision, we never see any controversy about who Jesus was in terms of him being divine or a deity.
And what significance does it have one way or the other, whether or not God was, or Jesus is a Unitarian or Trinitarian God? What significance does it have to Christianity?
Yeah, now that's a very good question, Tom, because the response to that is varied indeed. So I've written a book called Christ Before Creeds, and basically I put the case for Jesus not being God, the biblical case for that. But I finish by saying, at the end of the day, when all is said and done, let's keep this in perspective. It ultimately doesn't matter a great deal. The most important things about Jesus in terms of, his mission, his message, his life, his death and resurrection, all of his teaching, all of his example, the things that are most important don't really rely on whether he was God or God's anointed. So, I say, well, look, I think this is what the Bible teaches, but ultimately, I don't believe it really makes a big deal of difference. I think whether you have a Trinitarian or a non-Trinitarian view of Jesus, the basics, the essentials are still the most important, and they're the same. However, there are many Christians who would beg to differ. There are many Christians who would say that this is a foundational and defining doctrine. And, there have been Christians, ministers, when they have found that I've changed to a non-Trinitarian view of Jesus, have basically said, I'm no longer a Christian, no longer saved. They'll pray for my soul. For them, I've left the faith. So it's a very critical issue for them.
And why do you think do they think that having Jesus be God is so important? Why is that significant to Trinitarianism?
Once again, I think it's because it's perceived as being orthodox. And of course, back in the day, back in the 4th century, from the Council of Nicaea, particularly through to in 325 AD, through to, later councils, right through to the Council of Constantinople, 381. This was a debate. This was the bone of contention within Christianity. This was where battle lines were drawn, and it was the contentious issue of the day. And even though it was never really solved theologically, it was more solved politically because, the Roman emperors at the time wanted to have a united Roman Empire. They didn't want a divided church. So they came in fairly heavy-handed at the end and said, this will be the position. That is the Orthodox position. And if anyone won't adhere to that, then they will be anathematized, they will be cursed. And then eventually it became a crime that was punishable by death, so that it became, sort of the issue that would decide, I guess, where people stood in terms of the Christian faith.
But doesn't really make a difference to his sacrifice of being the Messiah of, what is it? Sacrificing himself for our sins or whatever. That wouldn't really make a difference whether or not he was God for that. Because I think many Christians use the argument that God sent his only son to experience suffering or whatever, and that's some kind of a critical factor in salvation. But it doesn't seem to make a difference whether or not Jesus was himself God to that claim, right?
Yeah, well, Christians, some would say that Jesus had to be God to die for our sins, to be an adequate sacrifice for our sins. And that understanding seemed to not arise out of the Bible, but out of particularly Anselm. Anselm was a church leader back in the 11th century, and he grew up with a very, medieval moral set of values. And back in the day, your crime and punishment was determined by the person to which, or against which the crime was committed. So, for example, if you stole from a fellow serf, the punishment would be whatever it was. However, if you stole from the lord of the manor, then that was a much more grievous crime that held a much more severe penalty. And so he argued, well, for crimes against an infinite being like God, it would require an infinite sacrifice, and nothing less than God himself would be an adequate sacrifice for the crimes, against God. So that was his kind of philosophical and moral sort of, justification or basis for that sort of argument. But, I don't believe that's how the Bible teaches. I think the Bible always says that it was a representative death, that Adam in his sin, as the representative man, brought the curse upon all of man, and Jesus as a second Adam or second representative man, through his obedience to God, brought the salvation that was due. And of course, either way, God suffers. I mean, as a parent, I know if my child was suffering, I would suffer, and I would much more gladly bear the suffering that they felt than that they would. So, either way, God suffers. His dearly loved son, suffering means that God suffers too. God the
So what do you
Father.
think?
Yeah.
What do you think is the minimum requirement? So, for example, or minimum requirement for salvation. So, if Jesus hadn't been crucified, but instead, for example, fell and hit his head on a rock and died, would that have been sufficient for salvation?
No, I don't believe so. I think the two requirements for the efficacy of Jesus' death was, number one, that he was sinless, so that if he had himself sinned, then he would not. He'd have to, in a sense, pay for his own sins. He'd have to kind of atone for his own sins. So one was that he was sinless, but secondly, that he was expressing absolute surrender and love to God the Father, and that it was a demonstration of his absolute surrender to God.
But he couldn't have done that in any other way other than, for example, being crucified. Like, it seems like, couldn't he have done that in any particular way? If he had demonstrated his devotion to God and then died in any other manner, wouldn't it have been the same? What is the significance of crucifixion? Is there any?
Yeah, well, probably I think the significance of the crucifixion is that it was a very horrendous, excruciating death, so that, to absolutely submit yourself to that sort of treatment meant that you were willing to give of yourself to the absolute ultimate degree. And Jesus, prayed in Gethsemane. He said, Father, if it's possible, if there's any other way, then, let that be. But if not, then your will be done. So in such an extreme situation, he, I guess, demonstrated his absolute love, commitment, and obedience to his Father God.
And I am, of course, an atheist, so I don't believe that Christianity is true. Why do you believe in Christianity in general?
Yeah, well, I guess I've come to that understanding. Let me just share a little bit of my journey. So I grew up in a quite a conservative Christian church in Australia, and I just accepted what I'd been taught as I grew up. But I got to a stage in my late teens when I was also attending classes at university, doing philosophy, etc., that I began to question what I'd been taught. And I said, well, how do I know? I know what I've been taught I should believe, but how do I know whether what I've been taught is actually the truth? And so I decided to subject my faith to scrutiny. And I did the Descartesian exercise of saying, well, I'm going to just throw overboard everything that I can't be absolutely sure of and see what I'm left with. And so I doubted everything, was skeptical about everything. But it was interesting that in that place where I didn't believe it was possible to know anything for sure, the one thing, in all honesty, that I could not deny to myself was that there had to be some intelligence or some kind of something beyond natural forces that has brought the world to be where it is. The complexity of the world that we have, I don't believe could have been accounted for simply through natural processes. And that was the first step back. I thought, okay, well, there has to be some call it God or whatever, of some description. And then it was a question of, well, how would I know that God, or whatever you want to call it, or him or her or whatever? And I said, well, if there is a God who can be known, the only way I can know him or her or it is if they have chosen to somehow reveal themselves or make themselves known in more than just a general way. I mean, you can look at creation and say, okay, there must be great wisdom and great power behind this, but in a much more personal way. And if he hadn't done that, then there's no way that we can discover him. And then I looked at some of the options. I started reading other religious literature, the Bhagavad Gita and other documents. And then one day, I don't know why, but I picked up the Bible and I started reading one of the Gospels. Can't remember which one it was, but it was like I was reading it for the first time. I was reading the story of Jesus. And as I read, I just became impacted by the credibility and the authenticity of this person, Jesus, and the events of his life and his teaching. And so I then began to explore further and further. I read into the reliability of those historical documents. Can they really be trusted? And just little bit by little bit, I built back my faith to actually say, you know what, I think actually Christianity is the truth.
So what specifically, because you said that the complexity of the world as you see it couldn't be explained by nature and therefore there must be a God. Why do you believe that? Because to me, it seems like I agree there's definitely a lot of complexity to nature, but I don't see any reason to think that a mind would be a better explanation than, for example, a naturalistic force or something?
Yeah, I think that comes back to a little bit of presuppositions. So I guess to tell a bit of a story again, Tom, just imagine two guys shipwrecked on an island. They don't know for sure whether anyone is there. And so they decide to explore around. As they walk along the beach, they see about 12 rocks in the form of an arrow, just spaced perfectly to be the shape of an arrow. And as they look at those rocks, one says, well, I think that is just happened naturally, just through, being washed up on the shore, and it just happened to be in that sort of shape. And the other guy said, no, look, it's too perfect. I think someone else is here and actually placed those rocks deliberately. And which one is true? Which one is right? Well, it depends. I mean, one assumes that there is no one else on the island, and so therefore he assumes that it's just natural forces. The other one assumes that someone is there and therefore could have put those rocks in place. It's a little bit like that. It's your presuppositions will determine a little bit how you perceive it and the conclusions you come to. Having said that, I do think there is incredible evidence that there is not only design but a designer. I think probability is such that just that we have a universe. If you accept the Big Bang Theory, for example, that we have a universe that can actually support life as we know it. The probability of that, when you look at all of the factors that had to be just right in that initial explosion to get to that end, is quite incredible. And then to have a world like the Earth, the planet Earth that we have, that is conducive to supporting and nurturing and fostering life. Once again, there is incredible probabilities that have to be met. And then to even get the simplest form of life, once again, you need three very complex molecules all existing together. And once again, until there's life, there can be no sense of survival of the fittest or anything like that. It's pure chance. And for all of that to have just happened, to me, is beyond what I think is credible.
Well, what do you mean? Because if I see any particular object, let's say a rock or a stalactite or a stalagmite or just some object, I wouldn't know if it was created by a mind or created by a natural process unless I had something to compare it to. So, like if I see an arrow, obviously I think arrows are not something that comes about by natural processes very often. But things, when I see like patterns and laws of physics, now that seems to be something that is highly likely to come about naturally. Why would we assume that because the laws of physics are complex, that those would be like an arrow? Because I don't see the analogy between the complicated laws of physics and an arrow as opposed to a rock or something. Because a rock, if we look at any rock, the probability that that rock has exactly all of the divots and cracks that it does is equally as big as the probability of the universe. Like obviously any particle could be out of place and it just would not be that rock. But why we wouldn't think that the rock was designed, because the probability of it coming up with that shape is so low. It's just a natural process as far as we can tell. And so it seems like we would need some reason to think that seeing this level of detail would indicate a mind as opposed to just being some natural process. And I don't see the connection to that part.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Certainly, in terms of uniqueness, that's true. A rock is unique, and there's no, I guess, reason why its uniqueness should be designed as opposed to the uniqueness of anything else. But in terms of complexity, in terms of that which needs, a level of functionality, I think the analogy breaks down, and the complexity and the functionality, to me, is different to uniqueness. And even the laws of physics, I mean, we assume that they're givens and that they're natural, but that's an assumption. That's not something that we can know. We have to assume it.
Well, what do you mean by functionality? Because I don't see any like functionality to the laws of physics. They just are. Maybe like the functionality of a river or something. It just is. It does stuff. But I don't understand the comparison between laws of physics being functional as opposed to like a rock being functional or an ocean being functional. It doesn't seem like there's any difference between laws of physics and any other natural phenomenon we see.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that that a rock that is sitting there just is. It doesn't actually function. It doesn't actually have any sentience. It doesn't have any sense of purpose or functionality. It just sits. I think that's very different to comparing that with other organisms, and I think laws of physics do have a functionality. There is an action. There is an outcome. There is even at times a purpose behind them.
What do you mean? Because I don't see any difference between the laws of physics and a rock, for example. Those seem to be like the same. I think like the laws of physics would be more similar to a rock than to a conscious agent.
Well, I mean, in one sense, you could say, look, they're both givens. But yeah, I just see there is a difference, and also, just to extend that a little bit further, just in terms of purpose, if there is no creator, if there is no mind or purpose behind what is, then the whole question of meaning has no meaning, ultimately, as you know. I mean, we can make our own meanings, we can choose meanings, but ultimately there is no ultimate meaning. There's only there's only the meanings that we choose to make up. And to me, that's a very difficult position to live consistently with.
Well, I'm not sure I understand what you mean there, because I think like there are lots of models of meaning and purpose that don't involve a god. Like there are many religions like the Buddhist religion and the Jain religion where meaning and purpose are like laws of the universe, like fields, karmic field or whatever. And so I don't understand why we would need a god being to have meaning and purpose. And I think it actually kind of diminishes the meaning and purpose a little bit. Like having another being determine what your life is seems to have less value, less meaning, and less purpose than you being able to decide for yourself. And so I think that from my view, because I'm a moral realist, so I believe in objective morality. And I think that objective morality is better explained by something like a law of physics than a god, because if a god determines meaning and purpose and value, then that seems more like slavery than it does a true kind of value. It seems like the something more like what Buddhism describes, where value is inherent in the universe and inherent in individuals, would be a more accurate description of what I think value and meaning would have to be if they were really objective.
Yeah, well, I hear what you're saying. It's just the thing is that there are different belief systems which apportion and understand the world differently, and therefore would put different meanings to it. But be it Buddhist or Confucian or whatever, there is it's attached to a belief system, and ultimately to be it a moral, objective morality, or an objective being, that there is a basis upon which you can have ultimate meaning. If the universe is simply the result of laws of physics, randomness, chance, whatever, if it's just an impersonal entity, and it's derived impersonally, that's its origin, then it ultimately has no meaning. It doesn't have any ultimate meaning. It can only have ultimate meaning if there was a purpose behind it and through it. That's my take on it.
Does God have a purpose?
Well, he's purposeful, yes, and he has a purpose. I believe he has a purpose in creating the world, and he has a purpose for our lives. I believe that very strongly.
I mean, like, is there a purpose behind why God exists?
Well, that's the thing. I think that what you have basically two options. You really only have that you have an impersonal beginning or a personal beginning. And
I would agree.
And so what I'm saying is that if you assume an impersonal beginning, then ultimately there is no purpose or meaning if it's impersonal. But if you have a personal being that was there who created it, then he is the one who has decided and determined what is and why what is. And so, there is that ultimately he is the source of all. So he pre-existed the impersonal universe.
Well, that's why if we had just an impersonal universe, it would pre-exist everything. It would pre-exist cognition. But I don't see why meaning and purpose couldn't just be like a law of physics or something. And then they would be integral parts of reality. And so it seems like you would have meaning and purpose just fine in a universe that had them built into the fundamental nature of reality, even if there wasn't a God who dictated those things. And if there was a God, it seems like that makes meaning and purpose harder, because then the God isn't given meaning and purpose by something else, something prior to it. It gives meaning and purpose. So it seems like the God's nature wouldn't have meaning and purpose, and it would be giving it to us, but that seems like it would just be subjective. So like, I think for something to be objective, it has to be true, independent of an opinion. And so like the things that I think of that are objective are like the law of gravity, law of electromagnetism, the fine structure constant. Those are objective. And I don't think those are decided by or based on anyone's choices. And so I think that if we were to ground meaning and purpose in the choice of anyone, including a God, that would seem to diminish its value and make it subjective. And so I think that I don't understand why it's not just you, many Christians believe that you can't have objective meaning and purpose without a God. But I don't understand that, because it seems like if it was just a law of physics, then it would be even more objective than if it was given by a God.
I'm trying, just, taking a moment to understand what you're saying. I guess my question would be, how can you, if it's you're saying there's an objective morality.
Yeah.
That is like a given law.
Like a law of physics. I wouldn't say it was given. It's just like, I don't think gravity was given. It just is a thing that exists.
Well, yeah, okay. So it's a pre-existing thing.
Yeah.
Then how do you account for the differences in understanding, or the differences that people have in their morality?
Well, I think people have
a social construct, for example.
Well, I think people have different understandings of all kinds of things. There are people who believe the world is flat. Obviously, it's I don't know what your position is, but it's round as far as I can tell with all the evidence. And so even if people may disagree on the evidence, that doesn't change the objective fact that it's true. And so I think that the fact that there is a different interpretation of what morality may be from a social perspective doesn't mean that there isn't some objective truth there.
And if it's a objective morality that is like a law, is there any consequences to defying that morality? Is there any ultimate accountability?
There may or may not be, but I don't see why that would matter. So like, I don't think something is wrong because there is an accountability there. I think it's wrong independent. So like, I don't think killing a baby, for example, would be wrong because you were punished for it. I think it was wrong, and because it was wrong, you were then punished for it. And so it seems like the morality and whether or not objective morality exists is independent of whether or not you're punished for disobeying the morality.
Yeah, and once again, we're getting into a very philosophical sort of debate here, which which I'm not saying isn't in some ways valid, but it really gets down to it's very difficult to determine whether your understanding of morality or my understanding of morality is whether one is more valid than the other. It's very difficult to prove that. You can have your opinion, I can have mine, but it's very difficult objectively, scientifically, or whatever, to prove your opinion as opposed to mine. And that's often the case. And as I said, it gets back to two people seeing the same thing, the same arrow, but because of their presuppositions, interpreting it very differently and coming to very different, understandings and conclusions. So, I think it's ultimately, it's some of these philosophical debates really don't go anywhere because there's no way of ultimately checking or deciding whether it's valid or not. And I would say that's where we need to get to a different place and to say, okay, what's the evidence? What's the evidence that Christianity is true? What's the evidence that it is, historically credible? What's the evidence that Jesus was who he claimed to be, that he died, that he rose again? Can we assess that in terms of historicity?
Sure. And because my position, of course, would be that the evidence does not indicate that Jesus was holy or divine in any way. I think he was just a regular human being. I definitely believe he existed, but I don't think he was divine in any sense. So why do you believe that he was in fact divine? What is the evidence from your perspective that Christianity is in fact true in that sense?
Yeah, well, once again, I just come back to some of the basics of the historicity of Jesus, the reliability of the documents, scholastic opinion that Jesus, historically, existed, that he did die by crucifixion. That's pretty
Yep, I
much
agree.
validated, and his resurrection is one of those more contentious, beliefs. But I believe that once again, the evidence is very strong. It's not what would be expected in terms of natural processes, but the evidence is very strong, and the evidence would then say that this is the most plausible explanation for what has happened, and therefore, gives credence to the whole story.
Well, why would that be the most plausible explanation? Because I think that's the part that I would disagree on. I think that when we look at evidence of miracles in the Bible, I consider them to be about as reliable as the evidence of miracles in the other document from that same time period. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the writings of Plutonius, or Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger. They all had writings that included miracles. Like those historians wrote about the founding of Rome and included Romulus and Remus being raised by wolves. Now, I don't think that actually happened. And the reason I don't think it happened was because I think in terms of history, the only kinds of reliable claims that history can justify are claims of things that have already been demonstrated to exist independent of our imagination. So that would mean not miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, or UFOs. Any claims of those kinds seem to be rejected historically, even if because there's lots of them throughout history. But it seems like the consensus of historians is that those kinds of claims are not reliable to be taken seriously based off historical testimony. And so even if we do have evidence of the more human aspects, Jesus existed, he was crucified, he was buried, it doesn't seem to imply that we should also trust the resurrection data any more than we should trust the data from Hinduism or Buddhism or the miracles of the other religions, which we also don't accept.
Once again, I think you do an injustice to say that the gospel records of Jesus' life, his miracles, his resurrection are basically the same as a lot of those other myths. I think that that's a very biased opinion, which doesn't really look at the facts around the historicity of those things and the reliability of the evidence. So I think that's a very biased view to put them in the same category. The second thing I would say is that,
well, just to jump in, could you explain why? So because I see them as the same. I think that all claims of miracles, magic, mythical creatures, et cetera, are the same or start as the same inherently. So why would they not be the same in the case of Christianity?
Well, once again, I think you're just stating your presupposition. You are ruling out of hand any possibility that anything, sort of supernatural, paranormal, whatever, can ever occur.
Well, I didn't say that.
Be it historically or be it in the present. So, for example, there are many people. I think the statistic would say that about 40% of Americans have claimed that something miraculous has happened in their life. Now, sure. I know that the definition of miraculous is a very broad and vague thing. So, and probably a lot of that stuff, they're just saying something very unusual happened. But there's many accounts of things that happen very unnaturally or that, cannot be easily explained. So if you just say anything that's not in the normal trend of cause and effect, anything outside of that has to be suspect, then you are already ruling out a lot of empirical evidence. So it's the same thing. If you're just going to say, well, look, I think it's all a bit of just make believe, then that doesn't take into account the actual specifics of each case. And I think the specifics around the Christian supernatural, in terms of the life of Jesus, is very historically well tested and validated.
So I don't presuppose that those things cannot happen. Like my position is that we could potentially verify them in the present if they made novel testable predictions. So if you had a novel testable prediction of any miracles, magic, etc., and they were confirmed, and that is evidence that they do exist. In fact, there's a journal of an academic journal of parapsychology where they try to show that parapsychological events are in fact real using the scientific method. But I think the problem is that we know that there are tens of thousands of fallacies, biases, illusions, delusions, misconceptions, things with the human brain that do not work very well. And I agree that there are many, many accounts of mystical occurrences happening to people, but it seems like those are better explained by those tens of thousands of fallacies, biases, and illusions and delusions, because those are extremely common. One of the ones that I think is the most well known is called a bereavement delusion. A bereavement delusion is when you have a emotional connection to someone and they die, you can hear them, see them, touch them after they have died. And it happens to about 60% of elderly people who lose a loved one. They can see, hear, touch their dead loved one after they have passed because of how the brain works, not because they're actually there, not because they have a soul. And if you don't know what a bereavement delusion is, this is going to be an extremely profound experience for you. You're going to call it mystical, miracle, whatever, because you don't understand that it's just this particular kind of delusion in the brain. And so I think that unless you already have a way to filter out all of those, I don't think that those experiences count as evidence for the miraculous. I think that they are just most likely explained by the delusions that we already have a very strong evidence for.
Okay, yeah, no, I hear that. And look, I'm not saying that that every miraculous thing that happens, using the word miraculous, any unusual, atypical thing that happens, is necessarily a supernatural or a miraculous event. I'm saying that a lot of those would need to be discounted. But if you don't accept that they can exist in any way, then you automatically are dismissing every such case. So that was my point. Now,
Oh,
if you
I would
get back to
agree. I would agree with you
yeah,
there. I don't.
okay, yep,
I don't
sure.
dismiss them as impossible. They are absolutely possible, but I don't think there's any evidence for them. And I think that's the position of most scientists.
And it would come back to what evidence would be accepted or admissible, and that once again, is another whole, I guess, discussion. But getting back to Jesus, I mean, the historical evidence around his resurrection, that's been debated for centuries, and I think there's very strong reasons, to believe that Jesus, was resurrected, in terms of there's been no credible alternative that's been presented, be a swoon theory, be it that someone robbed the body, etc., etc. All of those, other possibilities have been put forward and discounted. I think the fact is that the fact that Christianity grew so quickly at the very place where Jesus was said, to have died and risen again, that the disciples all claimed that they saw Jesus, that they were willing to die for that. There's just there's a lot of evidence that would have to be discounted, in all of that.
Well, so I think that your first question is like, what counts as evidence is an important question. And I think that what counts as evidence is anything that can differentiate imagination from reality. So the important thing is, can you filter out those 10,000 fallacies, biases, et cetera, et cetera? And in the case of the gospel testimonies of the resurrection of Jesus, it seems like those can be well explained as a bereavement delusion. Bereavement delusions are extremely common. They happen to a large number of people. They happen to collections of people together. Family members can, at the same time, hear, see, touch, etc. The dead loved one simultaneously, because the way it works is it's from neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is things that you experience a lot, or happening a lot, or expecting to happen, are primed in your brain. And when you have a powerful emotional experience, it causes you to ignite or light up those areas of the brain that have been developed, causing you to re-experience those sensations. So like if grandma always read the newspaper in the morning and made tea, you can wake up one morning and you can hear the newspaper being folded and you can hear the tea going, even though it's not happening, because those things have happened so often in your past, and the habit has built the precognition of it occurring again into your brain. And so it's likely that you would experience those things. And it seems like those exact same phenomenon could explain the experience of the apostles who saw Jesus after his death. Those could just be bereavement delusions. And again, that's extremely common. Bereavement delusions are up to like 60% of elderly people have them. Extremely common things to have occurred. So I don't see why the testimony of the apostles, I mean, even if they're willing to die for it, obviously they would be if they didn't know what a bereavement delusion was and they had this experience where they saw a dead loved one. Obviously they would think that was a miracle or something. And so them being willing to die for it would make perfect sense, even if it was just a delusion. And so I don't see why that explanation, because we already have lots and lots of evidence of bereavement delusions happening, wouldn't be a better explanation than to say he actually rose from the dead.
Yeah, once again, this is just another way to try to explain away the facts that we have them. I don't believe the accounts as written, in the Gospels back up a delusional, theory. You've got, for example, all of the disciples and different people seeing Jesus at different times. They not only see him, they touch him, they see him eat, they interact with him. At one state, cause, you've got 500 people at one time. This is all being said when many of those people are still alive and would have been able to discount, these accounts and totally undermine Christianity if they weren't true. You also have, if it was just delusion, then you still have to explain away the empty grave. You still have to explain away why the authorities didn't display Jesus' body to disprove those delusions. I mean, there are so many facts that you are overlooking or choosing not to take into account in this delusional theory. So you can put forward a theory, but once again, does it stack up with the facts as we have them?
Well, I'm not sure which part of that wasn't explained by bereavement delusion, because bereavement delusion, again, as I mentioned before, families can see the same dead loved one. They can see them eat. I mentioned the tea. They can touch them. So those are all factors that are true of bereavement delusion. So all of those things would be true if Jesus rose and if it was a bereavement delusion. It's also the case that whether or not Jesus rose or if it was a bereavement delusion, the people at the time period would think it was real because they didn't know what a bereavement delusion was. Though we didn't have the same level of science that we do today. And so they would believe it. And so even if they lived at the time period, they would still confirm the experience of seeing and touching Jesus, whether or not it was a delusion. They'd still believe it was true. And so all of those factors that you listed seem to be explained both by bereavement delusion and by Jesus rising from the dead. The 500, I think, is explained by the miracle of Fatima. It's called communal reinforcement. That's essentially just a factor of something happens people can't explain in a large group, and a large group, somebody in the group attributes it to some cause, and then psychologically, people are more likely to accept that as the actual cause if it's not something they understand. And so, like the miracle of Fatima, seeing the sun move was attributed to Mary, I believe, and because somebody in the crowd said so, not because the sun actually moved. And so I think because both of those phenomena are extremely common, it's like grass. It's like there's grass outside, and if something happens, like an account of someone rising from the dead, it seems more likely that the thing that we know exists and happens all the time happened that time to explain it, rather than this new phenomenon of someone rising from the dead. And since it does seem to explain all of the data that you mentioned, unless I forgot something, you can let me know if I forgot any of the details.
Yeah, you did. Tom, you forgot about the empty tomb.
Why would that be a difficult thing to explain?
What I'm saying is just assume that it was, delusion.
Yeah.
Then you still have to account for the fact that there was no body, that the tomb was empty. The authorities at the time, could not procure the body. The Roman soldiers at the scene, there is a body missing. So you have to explain that in some way.
Oh, sure. So I'm a avid interested in the experts who research this. Bart Ehrman is my favorite scholar on this topic, and most of them agree that Romans didn't bury people who were crucified. It didn't happen. They're most likely put into a mass grave. And so I don't think that part is historically accurate. I think it's more likely that that didn't happen. I know that there's a famous Christian historian who put forth the minimal facts approach, Gary Habermas. And he added in the empty tomb as one of these things, but he then retracted it because it wasn't very well accepted by most historians in the field. That's the one that is the weakest of his facts, because it's not believed by most historians that the Romans would do that, because people who are crucified are universally thrown into mass graves. They don't get burials because that defeats the entire point of the crucifixion. It's meant to humiliate and to make you the same as all of the other criminals, and not giving them a burial is a I forget, legislated part of the experience. You're literally supposed to be put into a mass grave. So it's very implausible, historically speaking, that would have happened. So it seems more plausible that he was put into a mass grave, and the part of the empty tomb was probably made up later, because the whole part about putting a stone in front of the tomb, there's just no historical basis of that. for ever the Romans ever doing that for any circumstances. And so it seems more likely that that was an addition later.
Yeah, well, once again, for example, the stone in front of a tomb, that was normal Jewish burial practice, as as we see even with Lazarus a couple of chapters prior. So, you're making a lot of, assumptions that would say that, I don't believe that the gospel accounts are accurate, that, you're making assumptions around that. And I'm saying, okay, if you're going to make those assumptions, then there needs to be some reason why you would have a good basis to discredit those accounts, because the accounts that we have, stand up very well and historically. And as I said, this has been debated for centuries by many historians and others, both Christian and non-Christian, and the facts do stack up really well in terms of the historicity of the resurrection.
So why do you think it is that most academic historians don't accept the miracles of the Bible?
Well, I think once again you're making a very sweeping generalization, and I would once again come back to I don't think that historically they have any basis. It's more a presuppositional position. It's a presupposition that says such things don't normally occur, therefore we don't believe they happened.
Wasn't that just induction?
No.
Because if I said there was a leprechaun that stole my gold bar or something, it seems like we would conclude that this probably didn't happen. Probably I'm making things up, or I had a delusion, because we just don't have any past evidence of leprechauns. And so if there was some new event like a resurrection, it seems more reasonable that unless we have a novel testable prediction or some kind of repeatable verifiable test, to probably believe it was more likely a delusion, because delusions are really common. This is a thing that happens all the time. And so we would probably attribute any of these new things like miracles, magic, leprechauns, unicorns, fairies, etc., to be caused by something extremely common like a delusion, because that explains all of the data, without actually needing to think that it really happened. And to think that it really happened probably would require something more reliable than testimony, because testimony isn't very reliable. Like in a court of law, if I went to a court of law and said that my aunt was killed by a dark wizard who used the Avada Kedavra spell from Harry Potter, it would just immediately get thrown out of court. Like no one would take it seriously, because there's no precedent for magic. I'd first have to demonstrate magic was real, independently of my testimony, for it to be taken seriously. And I think the same thing applies to historical testimony, that if there's a historical testimony of a miracle, it's kind of like going to a courtroom and saying somebody performed a miracle to steal my gold brick or something. The courtroom's just going to throw it out, just like the historians are going to throw it out. Because if we don't have any precedent that the event actually exists independent of our imagination, and we have tons and tons and tons of evidence of the same kinds of event being explained by our imagination, it seems like the historians and the lawyers are more rational to say that it didn't happen, because we know that there's a really common phenomenon of people making things up that are very similar. And there's apparently no evidence that miracles can happen independent of these experiences.
Once again, I would say, people can explain away or give explanations, all sort of fanciful explanations on events that happen. And of course, that then to come back to, okay, well, is there any evidence to support those claims? That's what you come back to. So, and look, science itself is inductive. It's not just deductive; it's inductive. And just because things have always happened in a certain way doesn't mean that they're necessarily are going to continue to happen in that way. There's a good probability that that'll be the case, but there's no absolute necessity for them too.
Sure.
I think Bertrand Russell was the one who talked about, sort of the hen in the hen house, and he just, based on induction, assumes that, the farmer who comes to feed him every day is going to continue to feed him every day until the day he comes with his axe and chops his head off for Thanksgiving. So, whatever we're looking at, there's always a sense of induction. And look, that's, look, I'm saying these things can be explained away if you really want them to. I'm just saying that, these things have been explored, but once again, you need to take into account the historical evidence that we have and decide whether that evidence, is credible and whether it's the best explanation for what we see or for what we have. Just to come up with a theory that says, look, this has explanation and has explanatory power, doesn't mean it's right. And I just think that, okay, you can have a bereavement delusion and use that as your theory to explain it away, but I don't believe it explains away some of the facts very well at all. That's my opinion in terms of if you're looking at it objectively. I don't think it does explain away, even if you do want to dispense with some of the historical accounts and say, oh, well, it was a mass burial, et cetera, et cetera. I don't even think that explains it away. I don't think it's an explanation, but to me, it's not the best explanation for the facts, the historical facts and accounts as we have them. And therefore I say, what is driving the bias? You might say, well, my bias is being driven by certain things, and I could equally say, well, I think your bias is as well. And I think at least the historical facts and evidence that we have, deserve to be taken on their own merits.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going for about an hour. It was a really great conversation. Appreciate you coming on. We have a few questions from the audience. The Pope of Atheism asks, can we differentiate Jesus's claims from third-party claims about Jesus?
Not easily, because it was, well, I'd say, sort of eyewitnesses and other people who also made claims about Jesus. And Jesus himself never wrote, his thing. So yeah, what Jesus said was what was recorded that he said. So that's not easily discerned.
Gotcha. Don Fullman asks, thank you for the super chat. How does the guest explain the problem of God not showing itself over the past 2,000 years?
Can you just repeat that? Sorry.
How does the guest explain the problem of God not showing itself over the last 2,000 years? I think it's like asking if God is real, why did miracles stop 2,000 years ago or something along those lines?
Yeah, well, that's where I'd say I don't believe they have. I mean, I've read many accounts of miracles. There have been things that have happened in my life personally that I believe have been miraculous that I don't believe I can explain anyway by natural causes. And I've spoken and know people who've had things happen where God has shown up and I believe has worked and acted. So yeah, I don't believe that that's the case at all. I think he's still showing up and still working and acting in sometimes miraculous ways.
Gotcha. I think that's it for the questions as far as I can see. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Okay, so, well, the book I've written is called Christ Before Creeds. It really is looking at a Jewish understanding of Jesus as opposed to a later Greek philosophical understanding of Jesus as is expressed in the creeds. So it's called Christ Before Creeds, and yeah, that's my book. I am thinking about actually writing another book, but that's just in the early stages. And that's the only really accessible work. I've written other things, but it's not really nothing that's accessible.
Gotcha. We got a few more questions in. GeoSam asks, if God will return, where is he returning from?
Yeah, good question. I don't have any clear view about that. It could be that he's returning from another dimension. It could be that he's returning from another place. I really don't know. I'm not sure from where he will come, put it that way.
Gotcha. Travis Statham asks, can you define faith?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people think that faith is kind of this illogical, step that that you take if you're not sure about things. But I think faith is something that we all have. To have a scientific view of the world, you still have to have faith in many ways. So for me, faith is accepting certain things beyond what you can prove or directly observe.
Gotcha. Mr. Creanine asks, ask Pastor Jeff if he found out Jesus was a clever fiction created to deliver a philosophy of salvation and morality. Would you think the goods of ideas that Jesus are still valuable enough to believe?
Someone once said you would have to have someone as brilliant as Jesus to create Jesus. In other words, Jesus was so unique for his time, and his teachings so incisive, and his morality so beyond what was accepted back then, and that it's something that you would need to have someone as brilliant as Jesus to create Jesus. I think that Jesus is so unique in so many ways, and the Christian faith, to me, is so unique because it's not, all the other religions of the world, it's all based upon what we do to kind of make ourselves acceptable to God. Christianity is absolutely radical in the sense that it's not your performance that makes you acceptable. It's simply based on the forgiveness and love of God through Jesus, who died in your stead.
So what would you say if
that is brilliant, and it's just absolutely something that's quite unique.
Gotcha. And so what would you say if someone came up with a new morality today that's even further ahead of its time?
It's not just the morality. It would be, the basis for that morality. I think that would be also something to consider. Christianity is a morality that is not just this is a nice idea, but this is something that has been lived out, and this is something that has been shown. I think there's something about that. If there was a new morality that arose, I would need to assess it on its own merits, I think.
Cool. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks for the opportunity. Take care.
Absolutely.